welcome to the deep dive. We're diving headfirst into a topic that's, well, it's definitely moved beyond the tech forums. We're talking about the idea of a Bitcoin strategic reserve.
Yeah, the material we've been digging into, it's based on some really rich conversations.
Yeah.
Covers the history, how governments and big companies are actually wrestling with this now, and what it could all mean down the road.
So our goal today, really, is to cut through all that noise, pull out the key insights, the crucial details, and give you a solid understanding of what's actually happening with Bitcoin adoption at these really high levels.
Think of it as your fast track, basically. Getting you up to speed on something that could genuinely change how companies manage their assets and, well, interact on the world stage.
Okay, let's unpack this then. To even talk about a Bitcoin strategic reserve, we kind of have to start here. What is Bitcoin, for the purpose of this discussion? Because the sources make it really clear it's not just one simple thing.
Oh, absolutely. That really jumped out. Its definition is genuinely multifaceted. It serves different purposes for different people, different entities. That definition really isn't the same for everyone.
Right. So for an investor, okay, it's an asset, like a commodity, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It's got that fixed supply, that scarcity. They're looking at it for potential returns.
But then for others, it's more fundamental. It's seen as a hedge against the existing financial system. The conversations we looked at actually compared it to like people holding physical gold bars decades ago.
Yeah.
A safety net if things get rocky, system instability, that sort of thing.
And critically, it's also acting as a payment network.
Mm.
I mean, in places where the banking system is maybe oppressive or just really inefficient,
Mm-hmm.
hard to move money, hard to even hold on to its value, Bitcoin is actually proving useful for transactions.
And that's a powerful point the sources really hit on. For individuals, maybe in tough situations, countries with high corruption, shaky property rights, Bitcoin offers this incredible wealth mobility. It's not like real estate, right?
Mhm.
Tied to one place. Bitcoin lets you carry potentially significant value just in your head, your keys. It's like a real getaway bag for your financial life.
So it's a commodity, a hedge, a payment network, a store of value, a mobility tool. It kind of defies easy labels, doesn't it? And maybe that adaptability is why it's getting traction.
Precisely. It's that chameleon quality, I think, that draws interest from such a wide spectrum, from, individual users right up to potential nation states.
Okay, let's rewind the tape a bit. The analysis goes right back to the start, mentioning Satoshi Nakamoto's early warnings.
Yeah, there's this interesting note that Satoshi was apparently worried about Bitcoin getting too big too fast, especially around that whole WikiLeaks donation thing. The thinking is maybe Satoshi would actually appreciate that it's taken, 15, 16 years to get to this point of serious institutional and sovereign consideration.
Which is fascinating because the adoption path was so unusual, right?
Yeah.
Normally tech starts big, trickles down.
Exactly the opposite here. Bitcoin was genuinely bottom up. Started with the tech crowd, the cypherpunks, engineers. Then literally millions of ordinary people got involved because they saw something in it, utility promise, even if they didn't, deeply understand the code. Now it's hitting the top levels. Governments, institutions starting to see its strategic use, like for trade settlement, if the usual channels are blocked. Think Iran, Russia.
It's quite a journey. From niche project to, presidential campaign talking points and central bank discussions. The material also singled out some early, maybe prescient voices.
Yeah. Names like Simon Dixon came up. He was apparently pushing for companies to put Bitcoin on their balance sheets way back in 2013, even talking to people like Boris Johnson about it then. Maybe not using the exact phrase strategic reserve, but the core idea of Bitcoin as a corporate asset, it was there a decade ago.
And Hal Finney, one of the absolute originals, making predictions that must have sounded utterly insane back in, 2009, 2010. $10 million per Bitcoin.
Laughable, right, at the time. But then you factor in that fixed 21 million supply, and you think about the potential demand from these massive new players just starting to look at it. Suddenly, maybe it doesn't sound quite so crazy anymore.
It really shows how fast perceptions have shifted. And speaking of missed opportunities on a huge scale, the sources brought up this really striking example from Argentina back in 2014.
Oh, this one's incredible. So there was this financial analyst there, Carlos, who actually proposed putting just 1%, tiny amount, 1% of the country's reserves into Bitcoin. Back then, that was about $452,000.
They didn't bite.
Nope. And The source material uses this to highlight the cost of not acting, the inertia in big organizations.
Mm.
If Argentina had made that pretty modest, 450K-ish investment in 2014, given Bitcoin's price move since then, that stash would now be worth somewhere between 41 and $45 billion.
41 billion. Just think. That could have fundamentally altered their whole financial picture, helped fight the very inflation problems they struggle with. The point made was Argentina probably won't be the last country we look back on in 10 years and see a similar staggering missed chance because they didn't take that small step early.
And that tees up this whole concept of sovereign game theory that the material gets into.
Okay, game theory. But at a national level,
Yeah.
how does that apply to Bitcoin?
Well, it's baked right into Bitcoin's code, really. That absolute cap, 21 million coins, no more. And the difficulty adjustment, how mining automatically gets harder as more miners join, keeping the block time steady. These aren't just tech specs. They create really powerful economic incentives. Miners, people running nodes, long-term holders, anyone with skin in the game, they have a vested interest in making sure that 21 million cap stays 21 million.
Because if that scarcity disappears, the value of what they're holding tanks. So they're paid, essentially, to guard the network's core rules.
Exactly. They become these distributed guardians of the scarcity. And the more players who understand that dynamic, the stronger that collective shield becomes. That's the game theory playing out. And it's starting to force governments, big institutions, to pay attention in a way they maybe didn't have to before.
And this connects to that shift in reputational risk that the sources mentioned.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It used to be, if you were high up in government or finance, bringing up Bitcoin seriously felt like putting your career on the line.
Yeah.
Fringe stuff, right? Speculative. But the material argues that's flipped. Now the risk is increasingly in not looking at it, in not understanding it.
So like a CFO today, even if they end up saying, no, not for us, they almost have to do the homework, just from a risk management angle, to see what competitors might be doing, what the landscape looks like.
Pretty much. It's just become too big a factor to completely ignore. That fear of missing out, the FOMO. It's not just for retail investors anymore. It seems to be influencing boardrooms and, well, maybe even cabinet meetings now.
Okay, so who is taking action? The material dives into several examples. El Salvador gets called an amazing case study.
It really is. I mean, think about it. A small country, heavily reliant on the U.S. dollar, basically subject to Fed decisions. And their young president, Nayib Bukele, just took this massive leap, made Bitcoin legal tender.
And they got hammered for it, right, from the IMF, rating agencies.
Oh, yeah, immense pressure. But the sources suggest it's paid off remarkably well. They were surprisingly transparent about it, too, posting every purchase publicly, showing wallet addresses, that kind of thing.
And the results.
Tourism apparently jumped something like 30%. El Salvador literally became a destination, a kind of haven for the Bitcoin community.
The sources did mention some initial hiccups, right, with the wallet rollout.
For sure, the Chivo wallet had issues at launch, but apparently they've made significant improvements since then. And Bukele, he definitely didn't back down from the IMF pressure.
He seemed to enjoy poking them a bit.
Totally. He was kind of famous for, trolling the IMF on Twitter, announcing more Bitcoin buys right after they criticized him. So whether you officially call it a strategic reserve or not, their actions show a clear strategy of accumulating and using Bitcoin at the state level.
Okay, so that's the open, transparent approach. What about the opposite, the stealth method?
That brings us to Bhutan. The sources contrasted it directly with El Salvador. Turns out Bhutan had been quietly mining Bitcoin for years.
Mining it themselves.
Yeah, using their abundant hydropower, apparently often using energy that might have otherwise just gone to waste, building up a reserve completely under the radar.
And that worked out well for them.
According to the material, yes, absolutely. By using sustainable, sometimes surplus energy, they basically created this asset without having to buy it on the market with fiat currency. It's reportedly helped their infrastructure and done wonders for their balance sheet, all done very quietly.
Okay, shifting gears geopolitically. Iran. The sources call this a special case.
It really is, and it's driven mostly by, necessity. Because of the heavy sanctions, Iran's largely cut off from the dollar system, from SWIFT. So for them, Bitcoin isn't just an investment choice, it's almost a survival tool, a way to settle international trade outside the traditional sanctioned rails.
And the state is involved in the mining.
The material suggests mining there is somewhat nationalized. Miners might have to deposit some or all of their Bitcoin into the state treasury, and that Bitcoin is then used for trade settlements. And interestingly, the Central Bank of Iran was highlighted as maybe one of the only central banks in the world that's openly sort of pro-Bitcoin simply because they recognize its unique usefulness in their specific situation. The sources also mentioned they launched a CBDC on Kish Island, but that seems separate from Bitcoin's role in external trade.
While some are accumulating, others seem to be going the other way. Germany was mentioned.
Yeah, a contrast. Germany apparently seized a large amount of Bitcoin, like 54,000 BTC, and recently started selling it off. The material suggests they might already be regretting that. Another potential missed opportunity unfolding in real time, maybe like Argentina, but playing out now.
A real divergence in strategies.
Yeah.
What about the U.S.? The Trump effect came up.
Yeah, look, regardless of anyone's politics, the material points out that former President Trump has definitely pushed the term strategic Bitcoin reserve into the mainstream political conversation.
He's apparently compared it to the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, like a national security asset.
That's the analogy drawn, yeah. The idea being it could ensure the ability to transact in a crisis, maybe faster or cheaper than moving physical gold around.
But where does it actually stand? Is it happening?
Well, the key thing is there was an executive order related to crypto, but that's not law. It could be reversed by the next administration. To have a formal, enduring strategic reserve, you'd likely need Congress to approve it.
And then there's the tricky question of how to pay for it without, using taxpayer money directly in a way that causes political backlash.
Exactly. The sources mentioned that idea, maybe floated somewhat jokingly by Elon Musk with the Doge.gov thing, of auditing government spending, finding waste, and then using those recovered funds. The logic being, if it's money saved from waste, maybe it's politically easier to swallow than a new appropriation.
So a practical funding mechanism is still kind of a hurdle.
Seems like it. The conversation is happening at high levels. Advisors like Bo Hines for Trump, Scott Bessent on tariffs were mentioned as people to watch.
Yep.
But an actual federal purchase. Still in the discussion phase, partly waiting on that funding piece. And the sources warned against, misleading headlines like early reports that Trump himself bought millions. That was apparently inaccurate.
And they differentiated between potential government action and, say, a private Trump organization buying Bitcoin, which would just be corporate adoption. They also flagged that political shifts, like maybe a change in the House Speaker in a couple of years, could affect how these crypto policies evolve.
But below the federal level, things are moving in the U.S. at the state level.
Right. New Hampshire passed the first bill. Arizona, Texas were highlighted as being quite active. Texas Governor Greg Abbott seems pretty pro-Bitcoin.
And there was this really interesting detail in one of the state bills mentioned. It apparently set a requirement for certain assets to have a market cap over $750 million.
Which sounds like
a clever, indirect way to basically point at Bitcoin without explicitly naming it, right? Maybe to sidestep lobbying or political roadblocks.
Interesting. And New York City Mayor Eric Adams started a council, too. The sources did credit figures like Trump and also Larry Fink from BlackRock with the ETFs for basically doing unpaid marketing for Bitcoin.
Oh, undoubtedly. Just by talking about it from their platforms, they've massively increased mainstream awareness and forced these kinds of high-level discussions. They've sort of legitimized the conversation.
Okay, swinging back globally. The GCC region, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi. The sources suggested they're primed for adoption.
Definitely. And the interesting angle was that they might be playing the stealth game, like Bhutan, accumulating quietly. Which makes sense, maybe. The UAE and Bahrain especially were actually way ahead of the curve on setting up regulatory frameworks for crypto years before the U.S. really got going.
And there was a specific company mentioned, Al Raj Restaurants in Bahrain.
Yeah, noted as the first publicly listed company in the GCC to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet. Small amount, maybe 5.7 BTC, but symbolically significant.
But the real potential there is the sovereign wealth funds.
All right. Huge potential. The sources mentioned Mubadala, one of Abu Dhabi's funds, reportedly having quite significant Bitcoin exposure already, maybe around $500 million worth, likely held through ETFs. And there's this real, energetic competition happening between the UAE and Saudi Arabia now. Saudi's pushing hard. The whole GCC picture seems to be shifting fast towards embracing Bitcoin more.
Any other countries showing strong signals?
Yeah, a few notable ones came up. The governor of the Czech National Bank is apparently allocating 5% of the bank's funds to Bitcoin. That's a serious chunk. Estimated around $7.3 billion.
Wow, 5% is significant for a central bank.
It really is. Then in Poland, there's apparently a candidate in upcoming elections who's actually pledged to create a strategic reserve. And in Switzerland, there's a citizen-led initiative trying to get 100,000 signatures to force a vote on whether the Swiss National Bank should hold Bitcoin.
So it feels like the momentum is definitely building across different places. And the sources also touched on the kind of diverse political figures becoming advocates.
Yeah, people you might not expect grouped together, like Nigel Farage in the UK, who became very pro-Bitcoin after facing financial deplatforming, very anti-CBTC. Even someone like Conor McGregor was mentioned as an advocate. The sources sort of linked this rise in advocacy, especially among maybe newer political voices, to the economic pressures on younger generations, Gen Z, millennials' cost of living, inflation, maybe pushing them away from some traditional policies towards things offering more financial control.
So it's tapping into broader anxieties about economic freedom and maybe government overreach.
Seems like it. It connects to pretty fundamental concerns about personal autonomy and just financial security in what feels like a pretty uncertain world right now.
Let's pivot a bit to the corporate side, companies putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets. MicroStrategy obviously kicked this off in a big way. The sources called them the unicorn.
They really are unique in their aggressive, debt-fueled strategy. And Material offered a pretty balanced take, the good, the bad, and the ugly of this corporate treasury trend.
So what are the main warnings? Why isn't this just a good idea for every company?
Well, the sources were pretty direct. For most small or medium businesses, probably not a good fit. They just don't have the same access to cheap capital that a giant like MicroStrategy does. Getting debt on favorable terms is harder.
Yeah.
And that Bitcoin volatility, it creates a real risk of margin calls. A big price drop could literally bankrupt a smaller company if they've borrowed heavily to buy Bitcoin.
That volatility is still the elephant in the room.
Absolutely. And the other key point, Bitcoin doesn't fix a bad business. You know, these zombie companies that aren't really profitable. Trying to speculate on Bitcoin to save themselves, that's just gambling, basically, often with borrowed money. You need solid free cash flow from your actual business first.
Otherwise, you're just layering risk on top of risk.
Exactly. And the ugly scenario is companies that kind of lose the plot. They become just Bitcoin hoarding companies, maybe getting into complex derivatives. The sources drew parallels to the dot-com bubble or the early blockchain hype, where companies just slapped a trendy name on themselves without real substance.
The danger of hype over fundamentals.
Precisely. So the advice for companies coming from the Material was much more pragmatic. If you have excess cash flow money you don't need for operations or near-term plans, maybe allocate a small slice, like 1% to 5%, and do it gradually, dollar cost averaging over time. That's seen as much more responsible.
What about Bitcoin miners? They hold a lot of Bitcoin.
They're a different beast entirely. Their whole business is Bitcoin. They live and breathe the cycles, the volatility, the leverage. They're built for it in a way other companies aren't.
And the impact of just announcing you're buying, like that Indian company, Jet King Infotain.
Yeah, announcing a Bitcoin buy, especially if you're publicly listed, can definitely create short-term buzz. Pump the stock price, maybe give you a first-mover edge in your market. But the source was clear, that hype fades. Long-term, it's the underlying business that matters, not just the Bitcoin holding.
And there are real risks, maybe hidden ones, for anyone holding Bitcoin through ETFs or custodians, right?
This was a really crucial point the Material emphasized, counterparty risk. When you use an ETF or a custodian, you're trusting that third party, trusting they won't fail, won't get hacked, won't misuse the funds. The sources pointed out how concentrated the U.S. ETF market is, with Coinbase custody apparently holding something like 80–90% of the Bitcoin for those products. That's a lot of risk in one basket.
And there was something specific pulled from the ETF paperwork itself.
Yes, and it's quite stark. The filings apparently state that if the custodian goes bankrupt, you, the ETF holder, might just be considered an unsecured creditor. Meaning your investment, which you thought was backed by Bitcoin, could get tangled up in the custodian's bankruptcy mess. You might not get your money or your Bitcoin's worth back. You're just another creditor lining up.
Wow. That feels like it goes completely against the whole Bitcoin idea of don't trust, verify. You're putting trust right back in the middle.
It's a fundamental tension, isn't it? You have people like Michael Saylor debating proof of reserves, but the core Bitcoin ethos is about verifying ownership on the blockchain yourself. These institutional products, while making access easier, introduce layers of opacity and risk that, frankly, many users might not fully grasp compared to holding their own keys.
Okay, moving beyond direct reserves and treasuries, the sources touched on some related trends and risks. Remittances and taxes came up briefly.
Yeah, the idea was that if governments impose things like, say, an extra 5% tax on money sent home by workers abroad, which was apparently proposed in the US, it could actually push people towards crypto alternatives. Maybe not Bitcoin directly for small, regular payments due to fees or volatility, but probably stablecoins. It could inadvertently drive adoption of parallel systems.
Which leads right into that CBDC versus Bitcoin contrast. The sources seem pretty emphatic about the difference.
Oh, very. And it's not just technical, it's deeply philosophical, political. CBDCs were presented as basically digital versions of government money, centrally controlled, potentially programmable, carrying inherent censorship risks. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is defined by its decentralization. No single entity controls it.
Control versus autonomy, essentially.
That's the core conflict. The material also mentioned things like the Genius Act, proposed U.S. legislation on stablecoins, notably excluding algorithmic ones, and J.P. Morgan's plans for their own stablecoin setup. But a key point about even regulated stablecoins is their backing often U.S. treasuries, which still ties them tightly to the traditional system they're sometimes seen as an alternative to.
What about innovation on Bitcoin itself? Layers were discussed.
Yes, this was interesting. The comparison was made to the internet. Bitcoin's main blockchain, layer 1, is like the fundamental protocol, TCP/IP maybe. Now we're seeing layers built on top for specific functions. Lightning Network is layer 2 for faster, cheaper payments.
And Taproot Assets was mentioned as maybe a layer 3.
Correct. And companies like Guard working on this. The potential here, as described, is pretty big. Taproot Assets could allow for issuing stablecoins, maybe even tokenizing real-world assets, but crucially anchored to the security of Bitcoin's main layer. The idea is bringing those tokenization use cases, which have struggled elsewhere maybe, onto Bitcoin's robust foundation.
Like building web applications on top of the basic internet.
Exactly that analogy. And the sources suggested that, arguably, stablecoins are maybe the only truly successful scaled application of tokenization, so far tokenizing fiat currency itself.
But new layers, new financial products.
Yeah.
They bring new risks too. BTCI was flagged as a danger zone.
Yeah, a strong warning against heavily leveraged platforms built on Bitcoin. Think Celsius. BlockFi taking on huge debt against volatile assets. It's a recipe for disaster, as we saw.
And the bridges connecting Bitcoin to other blockchains.
Highlighted as a major weak point, these bridges are often centralized points of failure. The sources cited hacks from 2018-2019 where attackers compromised bridges, sometimes even swapping out the keys controlling the locked assets. It completely breaks the not your keys, not your coin rule when you move assets across these things. Adds massive technical risk, massive counterparty risk.
And just to reiterate, volatility is still very much part of the Bitcoin story.
Oh, absolutely. The sources underscored that. Bitcoin's price is still heavily swayed by big macro events, inflation numbers like CPI, Fed interest rate decisions from the FOMC, trade tariff news. And yes, political pronouncements, while boosting awareness, can definitely inject short-term drama and volatility. You have to factor in those outside pressures.
Okay, so given this whole complex picture, the history, the game theory, government sniffing around, corporate moves, all the risks, the innovation, what's the core advice coming out of the source material for governments, institutions, even individuals trying to navigate this?
Well, for governments thinking about reserves, the advice was pretty clear. Stick to Bitcoin itself. Avoid altcoins or stocks.
Mine on stocks.
The argument is a strategic reserve should be something fundamentally decentralized, something no single entity controls or can easily manipulate. Buying stocks is like buying shares in specific companies. It distorts market signals, ties your reserve to corporate performance, and isn't independent in the same way a truly decentralized asset like Bitcoin aims to be.
Needs to be outside the influence of any one player. Got it. What about for institutions, family offices, individuals?
The key words seem to be pragmatism, education, and risk management. And crucially, don't go it alone.
Seek help.
Exactly. Find qualified advisors, reputable sources. Names like Onramp MENA, Bitcoin DXB were mentioned as examples in the region discussed. This space is complicated, and making uninformed mistakes can be really, really expensive.
Education first.
Absolutely. Understand why you're even considering Bitcoin. Educate your stakeholders, your board, your family. Do a proper risk assessment. What's your tolerance for volatility? What's your time horizon? What are your financial goals?
And you don't need to bet the farm.
Definitely not. Start small was the clear advice. Maybe just 0.5%, 1% allocation. Watch it, learn, accumulate slowly over time, dollar cost averaging as your understanding and comfort level grow. Some might aim for a slightly higher target, maybe 3%, and use rebalancing, selling a bit when it runs up, buying a bit when it dips to maintain that target.
Custody was another big one, needing careful thought.
Huge. How you hold it is critical. Getting help navigating the options is vital to avoid scams or just losing access. You have to understand the trade-off. Self-custody gives you full control, but requires technical know-how, and mistakes are unforgiving. Lose your keys, lose your coins. Institutional options offer convenience, but bring back that counterparty risk we talked about. The sources had an interesting thought here. Maybe our generation is the last one that really needs to grapple deeply with learning self-custody. Future generations might just grow up with more mature, trusted institutional solutions, like how most people use the internet now without understanding the underlying protocols.
And finally, staying informed means watching specific things.
Yeah, keep an eye on those key macro indicators, CPI inflation data, FOMC rate decisions. For the political stuff, try to go to primary sources, the White House website, statements from those specific advisors mentioned, rather than just relying on potentially sensationalized news headlines.
This has certainly been a deep dive. It really feels like this concept of a Bitcoin strategic reserve, or just significant Bitcoin holdings, is moving from theory into practice on the world stage.
Yeah, we've definitely seen how it's being explored, sometimes adopted in really different ways, driven by, well, everything from Bitcoin's own internal logic, that game theory, to harsh economic realities, political maneuvering, and just that basic desire for more financial independence.
Which makes making informed choices in this space more critical than ever, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And look, even if you just take small steps now, learn a bit more, maybe dip a toe in just to understand the mechanics, that learning process itself is valuable in this changing landscape.
Okay, so here's maybe the final thought to leave you with. The material we explored really hammered home that hard limit. 21 million Bitcoin, that's it, finite supply.
Right. And at the same time, we're seeing clear signs of increasing interest, serious exploration, maybe even quiet accumulation from really big players, major corporations, wealthy families, and potentially even sovereign nations.
So you have this fixed, scarce supply on one side, and potentially massive strategic demand growing on the other side from entities with very deep pockets and long time horizons.
Exactly. The supply is fixed, the demand side, not only growing, but potentially shifting towards players who think in decades, not days.
So what does that fundamental dynamic mean for you? Given that scarcity and this rising tide of high-level interest, what's your next step in understanding or engaging with this space?
That's the question to chew on, I think, after hearing all this.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.